Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in welcoming to the stage your moderator for this afternoon's session, Mr. Kevin Womack.
Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon at this conference. It's been a great day, lots of good stuff going on, and hopefully you'll enjoy this plenary session that we have going for the next hour. I'm amazed at all of the things that are happening in this area, and we have three great speakers that'll talk about even more stuff and all the things that are going on, some of the issues, some higher level views of what's happening in the industry. So we're really looking forward to this next hour. I'll do some brief introductions, then I'll just turn it over to the speakers. They'll go in the order that they were introduced, and then we'll hold off and have questions at the end of the session. So our first speaker is Mr. Steve Kuciemba, Principal Consultant at WSP. Steve has 30 years of executive leadership in the ITS arena, so we're glad to have him here with us. We have Jim Barbaresso from HNTB. He's a fellow, Senior Vice President and Practice Leader for the Intelligent Transportation Systems Group. And lastly, Steve Polzin from the University of South Florida, Qatar. Dr. Polzin is the Director of Mobility Policy Research at the Center for Urban Transportation Research, Qatar, at the University of South Florida. So with no further ado, we'll turn it over to Steve Kuciemba.
Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. I do have some slides. Let's see. Hey, look, there we go. Perfect. I know everyone's just getting back from the break, so I apologize if the doors are going to keep opening. They'll be a little bit noisy, but we'll motor through it as people start coming into the room. What I wanted to talk about today, what they asked me to talk about, is some of my experience that I've been fortunate to have as a consultant going around the country talking to different agencies, and how a lot of state and local DOTs in particular are keeping up with this fast-moving target. And everywhere you go, the headlines are dominated. Connected this, and automated that, and autonomous this, and driverless that. And you know, I know most of you in the room understand that the media gets those terms mixed up all the time. And it's a little frustrating for those of us in the business when we keep saying that's not driverless, it's driver assist, and we have to keep, in our own mind, bite our tongues and recognize that that's just what it is. But when you think about state and local departments of transportation around the country, many of them are struggling too, because this is happening so fast. And a lot of the questions that I hear, they're all over the place. Of course, you know, legislators, policymakers are often asking me, well, you know, how can I help my transportation agency with policy and with legislation? Of course, you know, DOTs are constantly getting bombarded by vendors and product developers and manufacturers of, I got the greatest thing since sliced bread, you've got to buy this. And how do they make those decisions? Law enforcement officers, I can't tell you the number of police officials that have told me, hey, we're not really at the table, but we should be, because we're worried about this. Everything from how do we pull over an AV to, you know, well, what if I'm managing an incident and there's an AV? How do I know the thing's not going to run over my officer when we're at an incident scene? And, you know, probably not unlike a lot of the questions they asked when the electric vehicle was introduced as well, of how do I deal with this from an incident standpoint? And of course, whenever you're dealing with the public sector, there's the age-old question of technology moves this fast and procurement moves this fast. You know, I can't get quite low enough of procurement is all over the place, of course. And how do you marry the two? I've lost track of the number of times I've heard an official say, well, I don't want to buy something that's going to be outdated before it even gets on the roadway. Well, that's part of the challenges that we go through in a fast-moving space. Do we have all the answers? No, not yet. Will we? Sure, we're working towards that. We're chipping away at them. And are we ready? Heck yes. Heck, we're definitely ready. And you get a good example here in Tampa with all the activity that's going on. They're definitely ready, and they're definitely moving forward. And hats off to Florida DOT and to Thea and to the city of Tampa for all the efforts that they're doing right now. But a lot of other agencies aren't to that point yet. And they're still asking the question of, well, how do we get started? How do we get moving? And one of the things that I love to do to go to an agency is to talk about TSM&O, Transportation Systems Management and Operations. You know, you here in Florida are very familiar with TSM&O, and a lot of other agencies over the past decade have started to understand the culture shift of looking at operations, looking at it from a customer focus. And when you look at the basic steps of adopting the TISMO philosophy, it's establishing your baseline, doing your self-assessment, understanding where you are, understanding why you want to do something. What's the motivation? Why am I actually going about doing this? How does this help the customer? How does this help me? Establishing clear definitions of what you're doing and what you want to do. Identifying a champion or champions, and identifying resources or many different resources that you might need to follow that vision. Engaging the different stakeholders, considering the external factors, and then, of course, the real cornerstone of TISMO is analyze, evaluate, and adjust. And it's performance management. It's the big circle. Well, we could really adopt that same philosophy when it comes to implementing CAV. And in fact, my company, WSP, just released a study last week, World Congress 2 weeks ago, called New Mobility Now. And this study was the result of global interviews. We're a big company. Fortunately, we have offices all around the world, and we were able to interview clients, contractors, vendors, automakers, stakeholders all around the globe on the subject of CAV, and we got a lot of great feedback. And the process that we kind of gleaned from best practices, if you will, of talking to all those looks strikingly similar to TISMO. It's mapping the now, looking at where you are. It's understanding the appetite, figuring out what's that motivation, why are we doing this? Conscious collaboration, that's just a critical component of working together with multi-agency, multidisciplinary, and I'll talk about that as we move on here. Accepting that it isn't all new, that you can adapt some of your existing systems, and finding that springboard, finding that one thing that you can do to really get yourself going. And I'll give a couple examples in a minute of that. I also get asked often when I go to different agencies for one piece of advice, and of course that's always hard of one piece of advice, look twice before you cross the road. There's a lot of different pieces of advice. But when I'm talking to the public sector agencies, the first thing I tell them is, hey, you know what? This isn't one size fits all. Just because Michigan did that doesn't mean California has to do this, doesn't mean Florida has to do this. And just because City A did this doesn't mean City B has to do that. Every situation is unique. There's different start points. There's different launch points. There's different socioeconomic and political and technical and environmental issues that drive every decision. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. So just because you saw another agency do that, I get so frustrated when I'll be doing a media interview and they say, well, which state's ahead? Well, pooey. Nobody's ahead. Everybody's ahead. You can't measure it that way. It's not linear. It's not simple like that. Likewise to the private sector. I've had a number of private sector companies say to me, well, I don't want to deal with 50 states. My advice is, well, then good luck, because you're going to have to, because that's just the way it is. And it's not just 50 states. I had an automaker say to me, well, I went to AASHTO, so that means we're all good. They're going to all be in line. Everything's going to be in line. I'm like, no. There's an awful lot of roadways that are not controlled by state DOTs. There's an awful lot of signal systems. In fact, a grand majority of the signal systems not controlled by state DOTs. So you're going to have to deal with a lot of different agencies. And you know what? Accept it. Embrace it. Recognize that that's just the way it is. And you'll be a lot better off when you do that. And you'll be a lot better off in your relationship building with agencies if you accept that. Now, I mentioned that I talk to a lot of different agencies around the country, and it's just changing so quickly right now. 3 years ago, when at the ITS World Congress in Detroit, Jim Barbaresso was the chair of that, and I was heavily involved with him, and we spent many years getting ready for that. It was a labor of love, if you will. But at that World Congress, I talked to a lot of different clients, and a majority of the agencies, they were still in the wait-and-see mode. I realize Florida's been going for much longer than 3 years, and again, hats off to Florida. But again, there's probably municipalities within Florida that haven't even started thinking about this yet. And when you go around the country, a majority of the folks were still in the wait-and-see mode. Just 3 years later now, just 3 years, and that paradigm has flipped. And now a majority of agencies are talking actively about this. They're going out and they're doing strategic plans. They're doing pilot projects. They're exploring future planning exercises. They're running scenarios. They're modeling scenarios. It's fascinating to see the aggressive efforts that are going on around the country in just 3 short years. Who said the public sector can't move quickly? They have. And it's exciting. Now, yes, there is a wide variety of how you'll define success in each one of these, and that's okay. And again, there's a wide variety of capability and maturity across those different agencies. And as I said, it's okay to embrace that, because everyone has a different starting point, everyone has a different motivation, and everyone has a different environment. Let me talk about a couple different starting points that have been out there. A number of smaller municipalities and cities and counties have started to embark upon traffic signal data sharing. Even larger cities, like here in Tampa, they've started. They've got a demonstration with a company doing traffic signal data sharing. And essentially, these companies that probably didn't exist 5 years ago, they've just really popped up all of a sudden all over the place, are extracting signal data many times from the central computing system, not out at the cabinet itself. They're repackaging that data and they're selling it. They're selling it to automakers, they're selling it to app makers, some of them are even putting it on their own apps. And for a lot of municipalities around the country, this is their first real exposure to connected vehicle or automated vehicle technology. Now, I realize that for the DSRC purists in the room, they scoff at, well, that's not connected vehicle. Well, it's not connected vehicle in the sense that you're going to be able to do a V2I safety application without the latency issues. But it is a connected vehicle in terms of vehicle communicating with infrastructure, getting information, and putting it back out to the customer. So for many, this is their starting point. This is their launching point. Another common launching point that a lot of agencies have started to do is form working groups. Now again, here in Florida, you did this several years ago. Hats off to you. I think it was around 2011, 2012, you formed your working groups, you did your white papers, you did a lot of great stuff, and again, kudos to Ed Hutchison and the folks at Florida DOT who led a lot of that effort. It was highly successful. And by the way, I recommend you keep it going, don't let it stop. But around the country, a lot of agencies have started to do this now. They've started to form working groups. And these working groups are multidisciplinary and multi-agency. In my home state of Maryland, for probably the first time in my recent memory, we have the MVA, which handles the licensing and registration, sitting across the table talking to the highway and the toll authorities, which, you know, at the engineering level, which is pretty rare to ever see that. You get policy and engineering together, and it's quite a bit of magic. It's also a bit of sausage making sometimes. It's pretty crazy to see some of the discussions that happen behind closed doors, but it's instructive. And these working groups are a means to that. The working groups are also helpful when you have opportunities such as federal grant, federal funding that's coming up. You know, when the FAST Act came on board a year and a half ago, it changed the paradigm for a lot and put all these new grant programs in place. The feds want to give us money through grants nowadays instead of letting Congress earmark it or through other formula programs. So having a multidisciplinary, multi-agency working group in place facilitates putting together grant applications. When USDOT did the Smart City Challenge 2 years ago, that created a lot of new working groups, probably 77 of them to be exact at first, whether or not all of them kept going or not, but it really precipitated a lot of different discussions. Another starting point is the National SPAT Challenge. AASHTO, ITE, and ITS America got together and issued the SPAT Challenge, essentially imploring public agencies to deploy DSRC technology and broadcast the signal phase and timing message at least 20 intersections by the year 2020 across all 50 states. And it's a great challenge, and again, it's not saying that your state is now committed to deploying DSRC everywhere. It's not saying that your state is committed to any particular application. It's a pilot, it's a learning exercise, it's an opportunity for you to move forward. I've got one client who is undertaking the SPAT Challenge, and they found that ordering the equipment was the easy part, but then when they started talking to their signal guys, they said, wait a minute, you're going to do what in my cabinet? And then they started talking to the telecom guys, and they said, wait a minute, you're going to do what over my fiber? And then they started talking to the IT department, and they said, IPv6? We're not ready for that, go away. And it was a real instructive conversation that started taking place, and 2 months or 3 months later, we've almost solved a lot of those particular questions. But because the SPAT Challenge was there, it precipitated a lot of that learning. So it was a great learning opportunity. This is incremental. This is not something that we're going to just wake up one day and everything's going to be right. And again, maybe there is no right answer. We have to take steps. We have to take increments and learn as we go. A graduated approach is the best way that you're going to do this. You're not going to just jump out of the gate and everything's going to be right. My colleague Jim after me is going to talk a lot about disruption. We're going to see a lot of disruption in the coming years, but disruption can be positive. It doesn't have to be negative. We're going to see attitude shifts. regarding driving, regarding car sharing, regarding ride sharing, attitude shifts as far as ownership of cars. Now, again, it may be different in urban versus suburban versus exurban versus rural, and over time, we'll see a normalization of that, but it will take some time, but we're going to start seeing that disruption over time. When we did our study within WSP, again, we came up with some of the key areas, and looks pretty familiar to you folks here in Florida. It's ACEs. It's automated, connected, electric, and shared. The one thing different that we did is that in our study, we tied it all together with the business plan, the business model of how do you finance, how do you fund, how do you move forward long term. And that's been particularly important to many of our clients who are revenue-based authorities, such as transit or toll authorities. It can look like a spaghetti mix at times when you look at all the different starting points and end points. But again, don't be intimidated by that. Don't let it get to you that, oh my gosh, I don't know where to start. Well, you do know where to start. You take stock of where you are, you look for some jumping off points, you look for some strengths, and you move forward. For those of you in the room that may be legislators or policymakers, exercise some patience. When I was in San Francisco this summer for the big AVS conference, Senator Brandes from here in Florida gave a really nice presentation talking about the way he approached doing legislation on this topic. And he said, you know what, I didn't get it right all at once. In 2011, we introduced some legislation. We learned some lessons to it. In 2013, we scrapped a lot of the old stuff and came up with new language. And in 2016, we came up with some new language. It's a constant iterative process, whether you're at the policy stage, whether you're at the technical stage, whether you're at the planning stage, it's iterative. This stuff's not easy. This topic is not a simple topic. I like to use this example a lot when I'm talking around the country. When you look at connected and automated vehicles, what we're really looking at is three different sectors that are somehow coming together to make this happen. You've got the infrastructure and owners and operators, and I represent many of those as our clients, and they take 5 to 7 years, maybe 8 to 10 years, from planning all the way up to cutting the ribbon on a new roadway or a new facility. And that facility is designed to last 50 to 75 years. Earlier in my career, I worked at the auto industry, and our cycle was more on the 3 to 5 year time for planning a new product to when you're actually rolling it off the production line. And most vehicles stay in the fleet and average, I think 11.3 years is the current average that's out there for a vehicle staying in the fleet. Then you've got the tech sector that could take as little as 8 to 10 months, and their product is generally obsolete within 2 years. That got covered up by the graphic there, but generally within 2 years, the product's obsolete. So what we're trying to do is bring these three completely different, disconnected spheres together, and it's not simple. But that's okay, because we can take our time, we can bite off a little bit at a time, we can rely on the TISMO process, the planning process, or whatever you want to do within your agency, within your organization. We can collaborate and coordinate, and we can learn as we go forward. We don't have to have all the answers, but we want to make sure that we move forward. I'll close with a statement that I love to use. I learned it from a boss back in the mid-'90s, Hal Kassoff, for those of you that remember him. And he told me, Steve, sometimes you just got to pull the trigger. You got to ready, fire, aim. You may not have all the answers, but if you wait for all the answers, you're not going to get anywhere. So sometimes you just got to pull the trigger and move forward. So with that, thank you very much.
All right. Let's talk about disruption. First of all, when you think about the 4 ACEs, automated, connected, electric, and shared, yeah, they're going to create some disruption. Disruption in the way we design our highways, our transit systems, but also disruption in the way we operate them. And that's really key, is thinking about disruption not only in terms of how it's going to impact the existing operational design domain, but also how that design domain is going to change. And we have to start thinking about it in a new way. So our challenge isn't just integrating of emerging mobility solutions and technologies into the existing operations environment, but it's also about thinking, what that future operations environment is going to look like and what it's going to be. We're going to have a long transition period. I think that's pretty clear to everybody here. And there's a lot of uncertainty, as Steve pointed out, about technologies and about the resource needs for agencies and standards and business models and regulatory issues too. And one of the things that recently occurred, and you're probably aware of this, is that the US DOT came out with their Automated Vehicle Policy Statement 2.0. This is an update from the first one they issued last year. And it talks about automated driving systems designed for the operational design domain. And what does that mean? You know, first of all, well, they give a definition of that. But what that policy statement is silent on is the need for new infrastructure standards and operations paradigms that are really going to be required going forward. So when you look at this operational design domain, generally you think of 4 different things: the facility type and the geographic area, whether it's urban or rural, the speed range of the vehicles, and then also some environmental conditions. But what I'd like to add is all these other things. All these other things, the level of connectivity and corridors, the amount of ITS infrastructure and data that's being generated within the corridor, the electrification infrastructure that's present in an urban area, for example. All of these things are really critical to defining the operational design domain for vehicles of the future. So when we talk about transforming this operational design domain, it has to be really a collaborative process, and we have to be proactive. We have to be deliberate in how we go about it, because we can't leave this to chance, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. We have to understand the nuances of automated driving systems in order to understand really how that's going to impact infrastructure and operations in the future. And I'll give you an example of that. For example, when talking with the auto industry, they're saying, you know, one of the things that we like to do is go to Virginia to test our automated driving systems because they have hills. And you know what an automated car sees when it's going downhill? It sees a wall in front of it, a wall of pavement on the upslope of the hill. And of course, it gains confidence that that's not a wall as it gets closer and closer to the bottom of the hill. And then as it's going uphill, what does it see? Well, it sees either blue sky ahead of it or trees. So how does a vehicle make decisions based on those types of criteria, the sensor inputs that they're getting? So little nuances like that are really critically important to designing the highways of the future. We got to start thinking more in terms of what the automated vehicle is sensing out there rather than thinking about it in terms of the existing infrastructure that we have, but also the infrastructure history that we bring with us, the baggage that we have. And then understanding these automated driving system use cases too is really important. You know, one example I'll give is, and if you saw it today earlier, it was the example of the horse and buggy, you know, or the horse pulling the car even. And you think, wow, back in those days, you had stables, you had a hitching post, you had a carriage stop out in front of your house. Those were all part of the operational design domain back then. And now we have gas stations along the side of the road. In the future, if the future is truly going to be electric, what is that design domain going to look like? Where will we get the infrastructure to support our electric vehicle future? So, I mentioned disruption earlier. I'll mention it again. But in this case, a very positive mention, because really disruption creates opportunity, and that's really key. It's not all negative, as Steve pointed out. It really does create opportunity. And so let's look at some of the opportunities, because many of them are based on business cases. And if you look at vehicle automation, and this is clearly evident, that in urban areas, shared use vehicles are going to enter the market very soon. And why? Because it costs so much for the average person to own a car in a city. I read somewhere the other day where they were selling parking spaces in Brooklyn for $300,000. I mean, how many Uber trips can you take for $300,000? Intermodal facilities for first and last mile. A lot of the smart city initiatives are working on that. Highway maintenance operations. That's key too, whether it's to protect the workers on the highway or to use unmanned aerial vehicles, for example, for inspections. And then you heard all about truck platooning and automation earlier today also. A good business case is there for that to really come forward very soon. So one of the things going on here in Florida and at a number of places around the country is the development of an automated vehicle proving ground. And what I suggest to you is this is a great place for validating automated driving systems, but it's also a great opportunity to test and validate different infrastructure and operational paradigms. I mean, just think about that. You can integrate all kinds of new ideas into these proving grounds, operational solutions with traffic signal systems and data management to support new mobility solutions. And that's really key, is to use these proving grounds not only as a testing ground for automated driving systems, but also the infrastructure and operations that are going to be needed in the future. And this is one of them. And you've seen this. I mean, platoon lanes where you can increase the capacity of a highway, for example, by dedicating a lane, a managed lane for platooning of automated vehicles. And this is key. Not only do you increase the capacity of that lane, but the entire facility itself. So this is something that could be tested out and tried out. And we have to start thinking along these lines in terms of the operational design domain going forward. You won't need it maybe as wide a lanes either in this kind of situation, and you can increase the number of lanes over time. And when it comes to connectivity, data acquisition and management. Steve mentioned, that surveying of practitioners, and we did the same thing. And they said, give us the probe data. Speed, heading, location, and we can improve operations dramatically through TSM&O opportunities. But there are also all these vehicle infrastructure applications for safety and mobility that can be implemented, and rescue me applications for things like traffic incident management, work zone, and evacuations and emergency management purposes. And one of the things that we need to remember is to be flexible, because the technology is going to change over time. So when you look at this, you need to create a flexible framework for vehicle-to-infrastructure communications, one that includes not only dedicated short-range communications, but also cellular-based communications, Wi-Fi, so that no matter what the vehicle is communicating, that the roadside unit can interpret it and use that data to support operations. And then for electrification, one of the things, if we are moving toward electrification, electric vehicles as being the primary, you might say, propulsion solution in the future, then we need to really talk about grid modernization, and we need to start acting now. Again, proactive, deliberate action. And where are the charging stations going to be? Is that where the gas stations are now? Do we need something like that in the future? And then, of course, the various innovations like wireless induction and dynamic induction on our highways so that we have electrified roadways, maybe with direct propulsion right out of the road. And then shared mobility options. In this case, integrated information and payment systems also are critical. And like some of the smart cities are doing, creating mobility hubs as centers for shared mobility services. And that's really key too, because this is where you can do some mode hopping, but you need a common payment platform and you need the information in order to be able to do that. And you also need the partnerships. That's going to be key. Partnerships with transit and with some of the other, you might say, new mobility solution providers out there, the TNCs and bike sharing, car sharing opportunities. And then finally, I love showing this slide because this shows you maybe the intersection of the future. If you look at this is an intersection with no signals. Wow, look at that. Cars are just going through because they're connected, they're automated. Now, you may not want to be a pedestrian at that intersection or on a bike, but I'll tell you, that's our future. We're going to see more and more of this as cars and vehicles become more automated and connected in the future. So I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. One is, all right, what's next? First of all, you might have read recently Uber and NASA are teamed up now to talk about flying cars. Well, that could be coming. You know, we got to start thinking about the operational design domain for that. Hyperloop, you heard about that. Challenges, and a bunch of corridors have been selected. But, you know, the last one I want to talk about, and this is really key because, you know, everybody's talking about, all right, if you can get a personal automated vehicle, it's going to promote sprawl in the urban environment. And because people can live farther out, they can sleep or work on their way in, on their daily commute. And I want you to think about that on steroids now. I want you to think about this, and this came to me like, wow, bam, when my wife was watching an episode of Tiny Homes. How many of you have seen Tiny Homes? Yeah. And I thought, what if we automated a tiny home? You know, these people are not tethered to place, you know, to cities. You know, what they really are nomads. So instead of sprawl, we're talking about the nomadization of America as people live on the highways in their automated homes. And they park wherever they want. They can work from there. They sleep on the road. And so what impact will that have on urban form going forward? Well, we have strip cities along every highway throughout our country. Will it be detrimental to our urban areas? And if so, how so? And so, again, I want to go back and say, we can't leave this to chance. We have to be deliberate, and we have to think through the operational design domain for the future of mobility. And all of these things have to be part of that. We have to begin thinking differently than we do now with regard to highway design, and we need to be collaborative, nimble, resourceful, and most of all, proactive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. As we move towards the end of our first day, it's perhaps time to spend a little bit of attention to unintended consequences. And this is a kind of a brain sink effort to think through a little bit of some of the issues that perhaps we haven't explored completely. There's obviously lots of bright folks in the room, and lots of these issues have been addressed, but hopefully there'll be some nuggets in here that'll make you think a little bit more about what faces us in the future. One thing that I think is important for folks to realize is that we're not just changing technology. The rest of the world's changing too, certainly demographics, governance, governance, culture, values, etc. So when we think about the consequences of technology, we need to think about it in the context of a very dynamic set of conditions that are simultaneously changing and in fact turning the world upside down. I'm going to touch on some of the nature of uncertainties a little bit, some of the key behavioral issues that are highly uncertain, some discussion of rare events, and then talk a little bit about the implications on transportation planning. I always use a disclaimer when I talk about the future. The picture on the left is from a 1968 US DOT report. They had the logistics part of transportation consistent with current thinking, except they had people lining up at a wired phone booth to schedule their vehicles, so they missed a few things. And when we think about uncertainty in this profession, we need to realize that those folks doing the weather, elections, hot products for Christmas, box office, stocks, etc., also struggle with uncertainty, so we don't always need to apologize for not necessarily having the answers at hand of what transportation is going to be like 20 or 30 years from now. There's lots of differences of opinion. You've seen those today in the earlier discussions. We've got very, very smart people, some with very long resumes, some with big bankrolls, and we listen to them and hear what they have to say. But generally, we don't challenge them in terms of rationalizing the differences in timelines, and that, to me, is creating a great deal of uncertainty as we move forward because we've got such a dramatic difference of perspectives on what's happening. I think these images characterize this. These are both from relatively high-profile media. This calendar year, Forbes talking about 10 million vehicles in operation within a few years. And the Navy, who's had trouble steering large battleships in the Asian waters, is reverting to some old technology to guide those vehicles, pointing out how things don't always go forward in a straight and obvious path. We're starting to see some much more meaningful pushback and thinking on what the future might bring. These are three particular articles that have come out relatively recently that all question or challenge both the timing but also the implications of technology. And you'll see some words up there in letter one author referenced something where it may be 100 years, and that's verboten. We'd probably throw him in the Gulf if he were at a conference like this. But another author similarly talking about how it's often easy to solve 90 or 99% of a problem, but sometimes solving that last percent, and in this case in the context of full automation, might be much more difficult than folks anticipate as we're making progress in some of the early days. This has led to a great deal of uncertainty on the consequences and particularly uncertainty on the timing. The three key behavioral issues that I think remain to be highly uncertain. There's some survey research and stated preference analysis taking place on some of these, but they're what I call key decisions: vehicle ownership, live, work, location choices, and shared travel occupancy. If you touch on vehicle ownership, a lot of folks realize that, we're not just purchasing functional transportation. If we were, we'd all have white Accords or Camrys probably. But vehicles are much more than that. They're ego, investment, image, hobby, entertainment, etc. And when we start to dabble with how we're going to change that paradigm, we need to recognize that these aren't purely economic decisions. Apologize for the switch in software versions here that messed this up, but this is some of the basic economic information. IRS shows us that 54 cents a mile is what they claim is the auto operating cost today. If you look at Bureau of Consumer Expenditures data and National Household Travel Survey data on mileage, that suggests we're spending about 44 cents per passenger mile on vehicle ownership and use. about 26 cents per person mile of travel in vehicles. We're looking at transit fares right now averaging nationally about 26 cents a mile. TNCs are generally priced at the $1 to $2 per mile range, changing based on geography, trip length, et cetera, surge pricing. And we've got folks talking about automated vehicles being particularly attractive because they're arguably priced anywhere from 20 cents to, depending on who you ask, 50 and 60 cents per passenger mile of travel. And the mechanism of pricing is real different than auto pricing. It's not lump sum high entry cost pricing. It's fully amortized variable cost. When we think about changes in vehicle ownership, we need to recognize that there's a fundamental change, a fundamental cultural change. Right now, individuals, at least that 80 or 93% of the households that have personally owned vehicles, they have an awful lot of self-determination about their travel plans. And with an autonomous vehicle future, we're looking at perhaps the individual's role being lessened and government and/or the private sector playing a perhaps significantly greater role in the future. And it remains to be seen how folks will adapt to that. This is a related issue in terms of folks being willing to relinquish vehicle ownership. This has been a particularly good year for seeing examples of critical weather and other situations where having that car in the driveway for those folks, for example, in California that had to escape fires immediately was particularly nice. And those kinds of considerations will weigh on willingness to relinquish vehicles as well in the future. This is a Gallup graph, and if we are willing to give up the self-determination of vehicle ownership, the issue becomes who are we willing to relegate that authority to, and the public doesn't trust anybody. And you could add other things, including churches on here, and they don't trust them. That doesn't mean 20 years from now these numbers might not be different, but you've all met folks that don't like doing business with Walmart or Amazon or Yahoo or et cetera because they're too big, too this, too that, too something. So there's this issue of in an automated future, are we comfortable with relegating that responsibility to government and/or the private sector? The location decision was referenced by our previous speaker. Will we nap till we qualify, so to speak? Will we have bigger houses and smaller garages? And will we have a compelling case for really both scenarios of intensification and development? The urban lifestyle can be considerably more pleasant and affordable if you don't have to own a vehicle. And if you've got good mobility services and transit, that can be nice to not have to own one. On the other hand, if you want to have a golf course, beach, hobby ranch, et cetera, being able to telecommute a day or two and ride an autonomous vehicle and nap can be very, very attractive things. And again, it remains to be seen what might happen here. The issue of vehicle sharing came up as well. Carpooling's been historically declining for multiple decades, and yet a lot of the environmentalists in particular, and some of the folks nervous about roadway capacity, are really presuming that we're going to find mechanisms through policy and pricing to change the paradigm in terms of sharing vehicles. And of course, that will be a challenge going forward as to whether or not that behavior can change in different ways. A lot of this issue here is references the rare events as perhaps more critical than has been appreciated in some of the future scenarios that folks are developing and advocating in some of their specific analyses. A lot of this, for example, logistics analyses and cost analyses are based on taking a trip table and assuming a single operator and dumping it in a logistics software package and coming up with this efficient mobility pattern, often with a single operator type vision, and the numbers can get very, very attractive in those scenarios. But if we've got rare events driving fleet size or multiple providers or multiple vehicle types, et cetera, things start to get much more complicated, and perhaps prices and service quality, arrival times, wait times, et cetera, start to change. The issue of what happens in the future as it relates to emergency situations is one that's kind of fun to think about. If we, for example, relinquish mobility to private sector services, but then the public's looked at as a means of providing transportation capacity in the event of catastrophe, that might not work so well either, so we'll need to think through that. The whole issue of refueling, recharging, et cetera, in incidences with power outages and storms and wet roadways, et cetera, is certainly one that will need to be dealt with. What kind of vehicles will be available to deal with emergency situations? Interestingly, about 25% of total vehicle miles of travel are by commercial freight and public service vehicles, and the automated vehicle community really hasn't spent too much time addressing the freight side, yes, but not the commercial vehicle and public vehicle side very much in terms of how that integrates with and impacts the ability and functioning of a more automated vehicle future. When you look at, this is a image from Puerto Rico, vehicles need to be very adaptable post-incident, for example, and be able to deal with those kinds of situations. This next quick series of slides talks about some other things to think about. This was a comment from someone at a recent SAE conference noting that as currently construed, the autonomous vehicles are power hungry because of all of the technology and sensors, and folks need to think about that when they think about efficiency. Some of that, of course, might get offset with technology changes in the future, but those all come at a cost of both time and money. It's fun to think about what happens to the liability business, all those guys that advertise on TV to respond to your accident if in fact we're successful in reducing accidents. And I did run some numbers. We're not going to leave emergency rooms empty. Accidents are less than about 1% of the medical costs are attributable to car accident-related injuries and fatalities. Folks have been paying attention a little bit to the issue of how do we fund transportation infrastructure going forward if we have alternative fuels and different business models of cars, et cetera, and what does that mean to us. This is a kind of fun one. This is a snow coverage map. Arguably, to the extent that autonomous vehicles are differentially adaptable or adapted in different parts of the country, you could have disparate economic impacts and a significant change in relative competitiveness across geography as a result of the conduciveness of various markets to automated vehicles, and potentially exacerbate, for example, the growth in Texas, Florida, and California at the expense of, say, the upper Midwest, as one example. This was also mentioned previously, the whole issue of emergency response and how the emergency community deals with automated vehicles. I'm going to, when I retire, start a MERS business. I'm going to make man purses to store all that stuff that we keep in the glove box and trunk, et cetera. And perhaps more important here, when we think about transportation transforming, I'm suggesting that we need to do a pretty radical transformation of transportation planning. Lots of folks have been dabbling around, what do we do, what do we do? Can we create new mode concepts to interject in our models? Can we find new measures of uncertainty to stick in our evaluation criteria, et cetera? But I think we need a much more radical transformation of transportation planning. I think the impacts and the uncertainty truly jeopardize long-range planning as we know it today. I think we've left the policymakers in a lurch, and they can turn to the planners, and the planners can shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know, it's highly uncertain, but that really diminishes the role of planning. And I think this creates a huge challenge for folks going forward. There's folks that are very nervous as to whether or not we need more capacity and how much more and when, and will autonomous vehicles give us more capacity or not? What's the future of transit, et cetera? And I think the planning folks really need to really refresh the whole transportation planning process. Even the stakeholder community is dramatically different, as you see by the types of folks that are participating in this conference. This isn't the old civil engineer, transportation operations kinds of crowds anymore. It's much more diverse, and it suggests that perhaps a lot of our planning activities need a pretty profound refresh to capture the magnitude of changes that we're putting in place here. New goals, new metrics, new scenarios, new data, et cetera. We really need a full refresh here. And with that, I'll sit down and our moderator.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. All three were great presentations. And so we have time for questions. So if anybody has a question, I would just recommend that you step up to the microphone and ask away. If not, I'll have to start the ball rolling by asking a question. Yes, please, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Leon Almonte with Kimley Horn. More than a question, it's just a comment, because the three of you basically carry the torch for those of us that are involved in a certain way with mobility, with autonomous vehicles. Looking at the presentations we had today, there's something that I think that we're still lacking, and that is the connection to the person. It's very easy for us to touch on, what's going to happen with traffic, the increase in capacity. But to give you an example, when you're talking with policymakers, I think it'll be really important to put a personal touch on it. In my case, I have 2 kids. The likelihood that they'll die before me is really high, but only in one area, and that is from a traffic accident. That is an area that in autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, can really help. So it will be great is when you're preparing your slides, if we will be touching on some of those aspects when talking to policymakers. The other aspect is similar to that is aging population. My mother-in-law, for instance, just no longer driving, and she's Dominican, so she doesn't speak English. But at least nowadays she can move from to the supermarket and back using ride services. And the third point that I just wanted to touch on, when we're looking at connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles, typically, even in the graphics that we use, we are seeing these beautiful slides with brand new highways. And I think the reality is going to be a little bit different. If we look back, they say that if you want to see the future, you need to look back where you're coming from. When we look at technologies, I can point at express lanes. And yes, nowadays we are developing facilities from scratch that are for express lanes. But I'm from Miami, so I can see what happened with I-95 Express, an existing facility that was repurposed to accommodate express lanes. So again, when you're looking at the presentations that you're making and the message that is being delivered to those that are just starting to see what's happening with connected vehicles, those are 3 points that I would love to see more of and more investigation on. What's going to be the impact to safety for our kids, for the aging population in the United States, and the impacts to the infrastructure as we are repurposing them for autonomous vehicles. Thanks.
Okay. Any responses from the panel? Steve?
Let me make a quick comment on that. That one of the things that mobility as a service concepts enables us to think about is, to the extent that we both need to customize the technology and perhaps customize the pricing, those concepts enable a user-side subsidy concept to make much more sense, where we're directing subsidies to folks that need subsidies with perhaps more precision than we currently do today with things like public transportation, where we price them low so they're affordable, but they're priced low for everybody, so there's an awful lot of lost consumer surplus to some consumers. And mobility as a service really does allow us to to target individuals and perhaps target both the product and the pricing to accomplish policy goals.
Okay.
The only thing I'll add, Kevin, your first point you made about connected vehicles and saving lives is right on the mark, and I think many of us subscribe heavily to that philosophy that connected vehicles have to be part of the conversation. In fact, that's been one of the comments when we saw NHTSA's version 2.0 of the AV guidance. It was very devoid of anything mention of connected technology, and many of us believe that needs to be part of the conversation, needs to stay part of the conversation. Yes, we can have the debate on the side about DSRC versus cellular versus LTE direct versus whatever, but we got to keep moving forward. We got to keep that debate and keep that discussion moving forward.
Well, let me just make one comment as well. Safety is always the number one goal of the Department of Transportation. 5 years or so ago, the deaths were down to about 33,000 a year. The latest statistics that have come out, they're back up to about 37,000. That's a huge climb in not a very short period of time. So I think we're all optimistic, share that point of view, that we're optimistic that the automated vehicle progress that we can make, the automated vehicle scenario is one that needs to, and we're optimistic that it will address this issue because it's starting to get out of hand to a certain point. Richard.
Thanks, Kevin. Richard Bishop, Bishop Consulting. The previous commenter prompted a comment from me and then a question for the panel. Regarding this safety issue, there's a common misperception out there that these amazing improvements in safety come with automation, and that's not true, and it's good news because it's coming anyway in terms of crash avoidance systems, and crash avoidance systems are not automation because they're very momentary. So we're going to see that crash rate go down because of these systems that are already available in dozens of car models on the market, automatic emergency braking, et cetera. That's great news. We don't have to wait for automation. It gets better with connectivity, but a huge number of the crashes will be handled by what's on the market now, just proliferating. So my question is, stepping away from that, there was a couple of touches on the trucking side of things, and I'll speak about trucks tomorrow. But from the infrastructure perspective, if you've been in this business a while, you've heard the infrastructure guys talk about and study the idea of exclusive truck lanes. And it looks great on paper, and the PowerPoints look great, but it's really a tough job to do infrastructurally and funding-wise. But when you think about level 4 trucks, driverless trucks, it's possible to start thinking about trucks that can go pick a speed, 120 miles an hour, and you redesign the engines, and you kind of rework that whole thing if they have their own lane. So I'm not a big fan of dedicated lanes, and it's certainly not a gateway to automation, but when you start thinking in those terms, it changes things a bit. So I'd like to ask for comments.
Steve?
Let me start with that, because I'm part of the research team for NCHRP 20-102 number 8, which is the Dedicated Lanes Project. And so we've been talking a lot about dedicating lanes, and surprisingly enough, it comes down to a lot of policy issues, and in a lot of places, taking a general purpose lane away. It's not usually a regulatory or a legislative problem. It's not often a technical problem. It's a policy issue. And how do you just simply take a lane away? We've went through this before when we converted general purpose lanes to HOV lanes, and there was a lot of uproar. So most HOV lanes are new capacity nowadays. We've gone through it again when there was conversion of HOV lanes to HOT lanes. And there was a lot of hubbub about that, and the term Lexus lane was thrown out there, and all kinds of socioeconomic imbalances and a lot of that discussion. But we got through that, and now we're starting to see more managed lanes when it comes to that. Is there a future where we might see dedicated lanes for connected automated vehicles? I believe the answer is yes. How that gets implemented is part of the big uncertainty. We mentioned uncertainty, all three of us. How that actually gets implemented, I think, is where we're still trying to go to, because a dedicated lane for truck platooning is one thing. A dedicated lane for car platooning is a second thing. Do you mix the car platooning and the truck platooning? There's not enough research out there yet to tell us whether or not we can actually do that safely. What happens when platoons get broken? What happens when, is there a platoon length that's acceptable or not acceptable? A lot of those questions are still being explored, but we do see a future, I think, with dedicating lanes.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on the safety issue because it's one that the automated vehicle community has used a lot to get a lot of attention and a lot of advocacy for automation. And obviously it is the single top goal for all levels of government as it relates to transportation and has been in perpetuity. We've got something like 35+% of fatalities that are attributable to substance alcohol abuse. Another 10-ish% are suspected to be attributed to other substance abuse. There is technologies, there is work underway on technology to improve in-vehicle sensors, et cetera, to help control that. That's a huge issue, and I think it would benefit the technology automation community to bring some of that into the table because that could be a real different timeline than full automation and have some meaningful safety benefits. Another aspect of safety is you'll see that 90% number thrown out quite frequently. 90% of accidents are human error, et cetera, with this implicit presumption that those will all go away if we've got artificial intelligence. And yet we've got in the high teen percentages of fatalities that are attributable to vulnerable users like bike and pedestrians, and you throw in motorcycles, et cetera, and you probably get up to the nearly 20% of fatality level. And while automated vehicles might mitigate some of those, you still can have poor decisions made by pedestrians and other folks. And so we really need to explore this issue of safety improvements and think that through in terms of how much safety gets fixed with what aspects of deployment of which technologies, and how does that change incentives and motivations and economic justification for subsequent levels of automation as we move through the process going ahead.
And if I could, I want to get back to Richard's question about trucks and dedicated lanes, because I think one of the things we're already seeing, and this has been around forever, is lane restrictions. Trucks are generally restricted to the right 2 lanes of a 3-lane facility or the right lane of a 2-lane facility. So when you begin thinking about platooning trucks, you're going to have to probably move them to the left-hand lane. So operational changes are going to be required in order to ensure safety, but also continued mobility also on the freeways and allowing ingress and egress to and from the facility. So I think that's going to be key. You're going to have to change that operational paradigm to support freight movement.
And freight movement in the urban environment is different than freight movement on the freeway as well. Right. A lot of the dedicated lane studies today are freeway-focused, platooning, but urban freight movement is a huge issue, and I know Smart Columbus is looking at a lot of those issues, and they're going to learn a lot from that. But we've still got, a long road ahead, no pun intended, of research to go.
Okay. One last question, sir.
Great session, by the way. I really enjoyed all 3 of the speakers, very thought-provoking, and my friend Jim, it was very thought-provoking in one comment you made, many, but one of the ones that stuck out, I'd just like for a clarification. When you showed the slide that had the picture of the car going up and down hills, and you talked about the system in the car thinking the upcoming pavement downhill was a wall and uphill was that, were you suggesting that so therefore, in future design of facilities, we need to design our highways to overcome the weaknesses of the intelligent vehicle? Because driver-driven vehicles have no trouble with hills.
Right,
actually.
right. And I would say, if from a general safety perspective, when you look at highway standards, you want to follow the highway standards. For human drivers to some degree. And that means, when it's feasible financially to cut the hill or to eliminate, horizontal curvatures as best you can. And that's for safety purposes. Well, the same thing applies to automated vehicles. And so in the future, I wouldn't suggest, no, let's go out and just cut every hill and straighten every road by any means. But I think there's going to be a requirement for very accurate mapping. The concern I have, if you don't have connectivity, is over the top of that hill, if there's a stalled vehicle or a crash or a work zone, how does that automated vehicle know that until it crests the hill? So those types of things, and that would apply to maybe a human driver also. I mean, so we still need to have connectivity, I think, is key in all these things, and good mapping of the highways.
But as big an advocate of autonomous vehicles as I am, it is kind of nice to know the brain actually can do more than autonomous vehicles every now and then.
Well, at this point.
Okay, we'll end on that note. All right, thank you all very much. Thanks to our speakers again for their presentations. And that wraps up this session, so thank you all very much.